Silence was an odd project to work on, to say the least. This video was most likely the most meaningful episode of my allegory. Not because the video itself has any meaning like previous episodes that had metaphors and whatnot, but because simply making silence was important to the entire series. Although I had come up with the Path of Silence when I first created this trilogy, I had never wanted to make an episode on it. At the same time, I needed to finish the Paths trilogy. I couldn't just leave it on Divergence and have a trilogy made of 2 episodes. The entire story had been twisted to the point where I had no idea how to conclude such a series in the first place. There were so many ways to end the allegory, so many elements to consider for the last episode, that it became too overwhelming for me. In other words, I was in a situation where I didn't know how to act, so I chose to not act. The excuse I kept telling myself for not making silence was that the path itself would be represented by me stopping the allegory. Divergence would be my last episode, and I would leave the rest of the story shrouded in mystery and silence. But of course that was a stupid idea. I had to finish this series or else I wouldn't be able to do it if I were to wait too long, then I would just regret it. This is why Silence is the most meaningful episode to the series, but not to me. My main reason for making Silence was to simply conclude the allegory of the void and be done with it, not to share a handful of metaphors and thoughts like previous episodes. For this reason, there is not a single double meaning or underlying message in Silence. All it does is bring closure to the superficial story that has always covered my metaphors throughout the allegory of the void. And it hints at some Halo 6 stuff that I'll just keep a secret for now, because I'm still working on my story. Another thing I need to mention is I was considering making a final explanation video, doing a summary of the entire allegory from the Edge all the way up to Silence. However, after thinking about it, the entire series is such a mess that I myself would struggle to explain the entire superficial story. That being said, I'll do my best to explain most of the story in this episode instead of a separate one. In the earlier montages, a lot is pretty vague and unexplainable because at that time, I wasn't sure where I wanted to take the series. As we get into the later episodes, mostly starting with Blood Moon, I began to have a better idea of what I wanted to do in terms of the superficial story, the one you see in plain sight. That being said, there's a lot to go through for this last episode, and before I do that, we need to go back to the beginning. The very beginning. I'll start this off by saying I have most certainly retconned a lot of lore I may have previously explained. As I say all the time, a lot has changed in this series over the years, and the story was built per episode, it wasn't planned out, so consider what I'm about to say as the final revision or version of my story. As you know, in the allegory of the void, there are multiple fragments who are the main subjects of various episodes. You have OG White from The Edge, Deadeye and his other variants being Black, White, and Gray from Eclipse all the way to Silence. Then there is Achilles from Path of Eternity, and as I mentioned last time, Emily, the female Spartan from Divergence, is part of the story but is not a fragment. Quick backstory on her, I used voice lines from Dishonored 2 for her. She uses a few lines from Jessamine Caldwin, the Empress that dies in Dishonored 1. Oh, spoilers by the way. Emily Caldwin is her daughter, the one you can play in Dishonored 2, so I just used that as her code name and it just stuck. All of these characters have some kind of interaction with either Faceless Gray from the Moon trilogy or Faceless Black from the Paths trilogy. The Faceless is a being who, throughout the entire allegory, tries to hunt down each fragment and fuse each one of them back where they belong. Each fragment was once whole, and their minds are all connected to each other even when separated, but they've been apart for such a long time that the connection has weakened, and it's as if they're completely separate people now. The Faceless does anything he can to achieve his goal of unifying all the fragments together. Deadeye Black, originally from Eclipse, is an example of that. The Faceless managed to control Deadeye, who would help him kill and steal the souls of the remaining fragments. That's why at the very beginning of Eclipse we see Deadeye Black stabbing OG White and taking his soul. The first soul that was claimed by Deadeye Black was the first death that forged the sword you see throughout most of the series. This weapon is the main vessel the Faceless uses to capture fragmented souls and merge them together. However, at the end of Blood Moon, Deadeye manages to free himself from the Void's grasp and shed off the darkness. Then he becomes Deadeye White and ends up killing Faceless Gray. Gray, thinking Deadeye was subdued, let his guard down and turned his back to prepare the ritual of sealing before he got stabbed in the back. Deadeye kills him with an infection sword, but there's literally nothing to the sword. I just thought the sword looked cool. Way back when I was still making the story for Blood Moon, there wasn't any ritual of sealing. I thought it would have been cool for the ending to have the infected sword burst out of the large central diamond, pierce through Faceless Gray, who would have his back turned to it, and then it would fly in the hands of Deadeye, and then it would just end there. Of course, that's just one of many ideas that never happened because it would literally be impossible to make something like that in Halo 5. Anyway, with Faceless Gray defeated, Deadeye White walks off thinking he can have his freedom again, but Faceless Black tears through both realities and attempts to enter the Moon universe. This very act begins to tear apart the Moon universe, and the Paths universe begins to merge with it. This is why you see the temple slowly change from Moon to Paths. Since Faceless Gray failed to get all of his fragments in his universe, Black steps in to finish the job. Black's only remaining fragment was to kill Achilles, which was recently done already. So after he gets out, he makes Deadeye fall to his knees just like Gray did, in an attempt to take the fragment's soul, but just before he manages to do so, part of the soul from Deadeye is called into the Path of Silence by Emily. The dark influence of Faceless Black, although it was short-lived, scarred Deadeye and turned him gray. Deadeye gets back up and sees Achilles further up, where he was killed, near the central diamond. Although his soul was taken by Black, his body remains trapped in the Path of Eternity, which is what is shown when you see another Achilles walk into the path again, as he has been doing for eternity. After a moment, Deadeye chases after the other half of his soul and enters the Path of Silence. Black follows him as well, of course. And on the other side, Deadeye meets Emily for the very first time. Unlike Faceless Black or Gray, she's not from the Void, but she's been stuck in it for such a long time that she knows how to manipulate it a bit, just like how she pulled the soul into this path, or how she can teleport around. She tried helping Deadeye by delaying Black's efforts in stealing the soul, but she realized she was outmatched and there was no point in trying to save him. Black is much more powerful than Gray, and they were in his own realm as well. She has a final exchange of words with Deadeye, essentially a goodbye, but throughout this entire event, Deadeye has no idea what's going on because this universe is completely new to him. Although he does know what the Void is, since the Void is also present in both universes. When Emily says Old Spirit, that refers to the Faceless, but also hints at some Halo 6 stuff that I've been working on. Her last line, "Let us be lost here together for a moment," is basically saying that she and Deadeye's soul will both be trapped in the Void, but she remains hopeful that everyone, including the other fragments, will be free one day. So although Emily gave up hope in saving Deadeye completely, she came up with a trick to get the Faceless to essentially chase after a shell instead of what he actually wants. Deadeye accepts his fate of being a soul trapped in the Void for who knows how long, but since this universe is still new to him, he ventures out towards the floating island out of curiosity. This Void is different than the one he knows. At the top, he discovers the Rune of Silence, one of many runes that are at the center of my Halo 6 story. But of course it's still in the works, so a lot is bound to change by now. So by the time my first episode in Halo 6 comes out, it'll probably have nothing to do with Silence anymore. Deadeye turns around and recognizes the sword used by the Faceless to collect souls. As I said, the shell, which is walking right now, accepted its fate already. So he walks up to the sword and waits for Black to end him. Black only managed to take part of Deadeye, but he's convinced all the fragments cannot be merged. And with all the pieces in place, the sword is summoned back to the temple, and the ritual of sealing begins. This doesn't seal the Faceless, only those in the sword, so OG White, Deadeye, and Achilles. And that's how it all ends. I left it open-ended to a certain extent, in case I ever wanted to do more with this story, but I'm still not sure if I want the next story to be connected to the allegory or not. I think leaving the allegory open-ended worked out well, because either Emily and Deadeye's soul escape and the story continues from there, or they simply stay trapped in the Void forever and the story ends there. Now that I'm finally able to put this series behind and look to the future, I can focus on more stories I want to tell. I don't see myself continuing Mind of an Editor anymore, since there's nothing to discuss really. That being said, let me know if there's any other topic you want me to discuss or some allegory questions left unanswered, I guess. Otherwise, the next time you see this series will be in a very long time.